To help us better understand Nietzsche's philosophy, it's helpful to break it into two different projects. Now, Nietzsche himself doesn't do this, right? And so this is a kind of imposition onto Nietzsche's philosophy. But I think it's helpful to isolate two different aspects to what he's doing. There's a kind of negative project and a positive project. And we'll see why this is helpful in just a second. But the negative project, the reason, so I'm calling these things the negative project and the positive project. Nietzsche himself runs these things together. He doesn't keep these things apart, and he never refers to these as the negative project or the positive project. This is something that I'm doing to try to help us understand Nietzsche a little bit better. The reason I call it the negative project is because the negative project consists of Nietzsche's criticism, analysis of contemporary culture, of where we are, right? And so it's negative. It's a kind of critical analysis of contemporary culture. The positive project is so called because it's Nietzsche's kind of positive vision for where we should be going. So the negative project is Nietzsche's critical analysis of things. Here's where contemporary culture is going amiss in certain ways. And then the positive project consists of Nietzsche's views of the ways things ought to be, right? Something like that. And so in the negative project, we are going to find Nietzsche's claim and Nietzsche's idea that God is dead, that God doesn't figure prominently in people's lives anymore. He's not central to the way people live or guide their lives. And this is true, obviously, for atheists, but then also for religious believers, or for many or most religious believers, right? So, and we've talked about that. A further aspect of this negative project that we've seen that he hints at, even when he's talking about God is dead, about these shadows on the wall of the cave, is that even though he's dead, we continue to use concepts and think in ways that only make sense under the supposition that God exists. Nietzsche sees this playing out in science, atheism, modern philosophy. We today continue to accept and abide by, think obvious, a moral system that really only makes sense under the supposition that God exists. For instance, it really only makes sense to think of people as moral equals, to think of all human beings as morally equal in some fundamental sense, on the supposition that God exists, according to Nietzsche. Right? It only makes sense to think of us all as equal if it's equality before God or something like that. That's Nietzsche's idea, right? And so our project, or our society, our culture, is in a state of tension because we continue to hold on to these concepts and ideas such as moral egalitarianism, even though we have lost or abandoned those beliefs and ideas that would justify or make sense of those values. And so Nietzsche's idea is something like, we don't really know what we're talking about. And when we say that certain things are good, or that you ought to, all people are equal, or something like that, we don't really know what we're saying. And so we must simply be, in our moral language, all we're really doing when we describe things as right and morally good and so on, we're not really saying anything, or at the very least, we don't really understand it. We're simply giving expression to certain feelings that we have, right? We'll return to this in a little bit. And so that's kind of Nietzsche's negative project. It's his analysis of our cultural situation and his diagnosis of certain problems that we're running into, right? We have abandoned certain central and core ideas that are essential to making sense of our moral practices and our moral beliefs. And so, without those certain central core ideas, our moral practices and beliefs are unintelligible. And that's where we are right now. They're arbitrary, they don't make any sense. That's Nietzsche's analysis of contemporary culture. You can think of that as something like the negative project. The positive project is going to contain Nietzsche's own views about what's good and proper and what we should be striving for. So the positive project is going to contain Nietzsche's idea, well, it's a good thing God is dead because Christianity, slave morality, is life denying. And what we need are values that are life affirming. And life affirming, of course, life here means something like the will to power. So, good thing God is dead. Good thing slave morality is collapsing, because we need something like a new noble morality. We need an Ubermensch, a remarkable high human being who will bring new life affirming values. And this figure might be terrifying. It might exercise power in a terrifying and frightful way. But we will stand in awe of this figure and their values. And this figure and their values will justify humanity, will strengthen the will to humanity, and so on. Now, I think one of the main reasons to try to isolate these two projects from each other, right? Nietzsche doesn't do that. He runs all this together. One of the good reasons to isolate these two projects is because when we do so, what we find, I would argue, is that the most unpalatable aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy wind up in the positive project. And the most plausible, insightful aspects of his philosophy end up in the negative project. And if we can isolate these two projects, well, then maybe we can kind of say, yeah, he's onto something with the negative project, and the positive project is kind of laughably absurd, or it would be if it weren't so dangerous. Because in the positive project, this is where you can find certain seeds that could be exploited or that could grow into some of the real, some of the kind of nastiness that evolved in Europe in the 20th century. The Nazis tried to make use of Nietzsche's philosophy, and you can see certain echoes of Nietzsche's ideas in Nazi ideology. When the Nazis talk about a master race, um, things like that, you can kind of see echoes of Nietzsche in that, echoes of Nietzsche's positive project, right? Power, the will to power. Again, you see echoes of Nazi ideology there. Now, there's a vast literature on the connection between Nietzsche and Nazism. And so it's more sophisticated or complicated than I've indicated. So, for instance, Nietzsche himself did write about anti-Semitism here and there, and he was critical of it. He was always critical of it. He thought anti-Semitism was ridiculous. Nietzsche wrote about the German people at times, and he thought they were he wrote they were not one of these master races. They were not particularly remarkable. The Greeks, for instance, according to Nietzsche, were far better than the Germans. So he wasn't all about Germans or Aryans or anything like that. And in addition, Nietzsche was very critical of nationalism whenever he talked about it. So there are many ways in which Nietzsche was not himself in a direct way a Nazi, but nonetheless, certain of these ideas, as I've been indicating, clearly have resonances with Nazi ideology, right? And so it's somewhat complicated. All of those resonances, however, you will find in the positive project. The negative project doesn't really contain them. And so what I want to do now is focus on the negative project. And I want to give you an illustration of the, well, how to put it. I want to show you one way in which a modern philosopher, a contemporary philosopher, a philosopher who is still alive, has attempted to use the negative project, has thought the negative project, in Nietzsche at least, is correct, and that Nietzsche's greatest accomplishment is this negative project. And this contemporary philosopher who we're going to look at is named Alistair MacIntyre. So as I've said, he thinks the negative project that Nietzsche is onto is correct. He thinks the positive project is absolutely incorrect. And we'll kind of return to what the upshot of that is for someone like MacIntyre. But let's see how MacIntyre uses it. MacIntyre attempts to illustrate this negative project using an example drawn from Hawaii, the history of Hawaii, using an example of a particular concept that the Hawaiians used, this concept of taboo. So, during the age of exploration, the countries of Europe sent out explorers, right? And this also was part and parcel of colonialism and so on, right? But they had explorers going all around and making contact with peoples who they had never made contact with. And one of these explorers was James Cook. He was a British captain, and he explored the Pacific. So he went off, very far away from Britain. He went off to the Pacific. He was the first European to make contact with the Hawaiians who were living in Hawaii, who had been living there for hundreds of years. And so the first contact between Hawaiians and Europeans was initiated by the British, by James Cook. Now, when one of the things that's kind of that James Cook did is he kept rather detailed journals of his voyages. So he kept these detailed journals explaining what they were doing and then explaining the new people that they had met. And so we have these notebooks, these journals from Cook, in which he describes the Hawaiians and his crew's reactions to them and their reactions to the British, right? And so these journals and notebooks are an invaluable anthropological resource, right? They give us a view into what this Hawaiian culture might have been like. Now, granted, it's a skewed view because it's a view through the eyes of a 18th century British sailor, but nonetheless, it's some kind of valuable anthropological data. Now, one of the things that really captured the British sailors' attention was this word taboo. The Hawaiians called certain practices taboo. For example, men and women eating together. That was taboo. That meant it was not to be done. You did not do that. Men and women were not allowed to eat together. That was forbidden. A lot of the other taboo rules, a lot of them concerned women and what they were able to eat. So I think women weren't allowed to eat. I think they weren't allowed to eat bananas, maybe bananas or coconuts, something like that. They weren't allowed to eat. That was taboo. That was forbidden. Men and women eating together, forbidden. Now, you might think, well, yeah, that enough. You might, well, why can't men and women eat together? Why can't women eat bananas or whatever it might be? And so the British sailors would ask him that. These questions were all the more pressing or all the more perplexing, right? These taboo practices were all the more perplexing because in certain other ways, the Hawaiians were relatively lax. So, for instance, the Hawaiians in their dress habits, right, were by British standards immodest, right? They wouldn't wear, they were much freer about nudity, public nudity, and so on. And this was, as you might imagine, to a 18th century British person, this would have been a bit more shocking. Like, what? They were a bit more, with regard to sexual relations, they were far more lax, the Hawaiians were, right? They didn't have nearly so strict of regulations or prohibitions concerning things like what the British would call adultery and so on. And so the British were very confused, right? You guys kind of you have far more relaxed standards with regard to sexual intercourse than we British people do. Yet you won't let men and women eat together. I mean, we British people, we might be, prudish in all sorts of ways, but we can, men and women can eat together. So why is that taboo of all things, right? They were really perplexed. But when they asked the Hawaiians this, why is that taboo? They didn't get an answer. When the British asked the Hawaiians, what do you mean by taboo? Like, because we're just confused. Like, what do you mean by taboo? The Hawaiians, at least by Cook's report, would simply say, what do you, we just mean taboo. What do we mean by taboo? It's just taboo. It's just taboo. They weren't really able to say anything further. They weren't really able to make intelligible these practices and why they were taboo. They weren't able to make these taboo prohibitions intelligible. They would just kind of, men and women can't eat together because that's taboo, and it's taboo because it's taboo. Right? They would just really quickly kind of run out of resources for answering further questions. A further kind of interesting wrinkle to this story is that not too long after the British had made contact and Captain Cook had recorded this and his kind of confusion over what these taboo rules were and where they came from. Not that long afterwards, the taboo rules were abolished with very little social upheaval or uproar. So in 1819, they were abolished by the king of the Hawaiians. And that's remarkable because these rules informed their daily practices and daily lives. These were rules that people lived by, that were there, that had been there for hundreds of years. And then just all of a sudden, the king abolishes them. And, okay, it's not a big deal. That's remarkable. If these were these ingrained rules and customs, why, if these were rules that, had been part of traditional culture for hundreds of years and so on, and you just get rid of them and it's just, okay. That's a bit odd. And so this example of taboo has exercised anthropologists ever since anthropology kind of began as a discipline. And the main question that people have about this, well, think of it this way. There's something perplexing about all this. And what seems to be perplexing about it is that the Hawaiians seem to be using a word and incorporating it into their daily lives that for all the world, it seems like they don't understand. At the very least, they can't make it intelligible to other people. How on earth did they come to be in a position like that? How on earth could people come to be in a position where they're using this word that perhaps even they don't realize that they don't know. Yet they don't understand it. Yet they use it in their lives all the time. It structures their lives. How did the Hawaiians come to be using a word that they did not seem to understand? Two famous anthropologists, Franz Steiner and Mary Douglas, gave an explanation. And what they claimed, and so MacIntyre agrees with this explanation. So this example is coming from MacIntyre. MacIntyre agrees with this explanation that Steiner and Douglas give. There's a two-stage history of taboo rules, according to Franz Steiner and Mary Douglas. In the first stage, taboo rules are embedded in a context which confers intelligibility on them. What does that mean? Taboo rules initially were part of a systematic worldview. And that systematic worldview is going to include certain beliefs about the way the universe works, the cosmos works, about the way the natural world works, and about the place of human beings in the cosmos, in the natural world, and the place of human beings with respect to gods and gods with respect to the cosmos and so on, right? A systematic view of the world, of how it all hangs together. Taboo rules were originally embedded in that kind of a context, in the systematic worldview that's going to include, say, myths or certain stories about the gods. And so, for example, the taboo rules, say the prohibition on women eating coconuts or whatever it might be, those were originally embedded in, perhaps, or justified by a story about how the gods did something with coconuts and human beings and whatever, right? There'd be some particular myth. And then the upshot of that myth is that women are not allowed to eat coconuts, right? But that myth, that story, confers intelligibility on that prohibition. Why can't women eat coconuts or whatever it might be? Well, because back when that god did blah, 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 right? And there'd be this story that would explain why, right? And it would ultimately be about how humanity fits into the cosmos and to the divine and relates to the divine and so on, right? And so these rules would be justified by some systematic worldview like that. That's the first stage of these taboo rules. But then, for whatever reason, and the reasons might differ depending upon the kinds of rules we're looking at, but that context which conferred intelligibility is abandoned or forgotten. But the rules themselves remain. And the explanation that Steiner and Douglas give for how the Hawaiians, when Captain Cook visited them, were using a word that they did not seem to understand is that Captain Cook visited the Hawaiians during this second stage. For some reason, somehow, we don't know how exactly, but the context which conferred intelligibility on those taboo rules had been abandoned or forgotten. And so when Captain Cook and the other British sailors asked the Hawaiians, well, why can't women eat coconuts? Why can't men and women eat together? The answer that really would justify that prohibition would be this story about the relationship between human beings and gods and myths and so on. But that story, that context has been abandoned for whatever reason. And so the Hawaiians can't point to it as the justification for this prohibition. And so what do? Well, they have nothing really to point to. And so they can simply repeat, well, it's taboo because it's taboo. There's nothing else to say because the thing that they should be saying has been forgotten, has been abandoned, right? And so that's how the Hawaiians came to find themselves in this somewhat odd position of using a term, incorporating it into their daily life that they did not really seem to understand. Right? The idea here is that no, they didn't understand it because they lost the context which conferred intelligibility on it, which would allow them to understand it, which would justify it. Right? And so that's why Hawaiians couldn't really answer the British sailors' questions about taboo. And that's why the taboo rules could be abolished with very little social uproar. Because by the time they were abolished, they were arbitrary prohibitions that had no good reason behind them. There was no reason for them. There was nothing that justified them. They were entirely arbitrary. And so when they were eliminated, it was fine. There was little social uproar because they were entirely arbitrary. Okay. What does all this have to do with Nietzsche? Why does MacIntyre go into all this detail? MacIntyre's idea is that our moral rules, when we think about morality today, our moral rules are akin to the taboo rules. And Nietzsche was the first person to realize this, and that this is what Nietzsche's negative project amounts to. It's Nietzsche's realization of this. We are just like those Hawaiians were, except we don't talk about taboo. We talk about rights, my right to something. We talk about moral obligation. We talk about moral evil, moral good. We talk about morality. They talked about taboo. We talk about moral, right? But we stand in the same exact relationship to our moral rules, to morality, as the Hawaiians stood to their taboo rules. This is MacIntyre saying Nietzsche is the first person to realize this, and that this is how Nietzsche has diagnosed our contemporary culture. We today have lost the context that would make the concepts and rules of morality intelligible and justifiable. We've lost that context through the death of God, right? Those moral rules that we have. So, for instance, think here of something like moral egalitarianism. Moral egalitarianism only makes sense within this older context in which God is a central player. And so we still think moral egalitarianism is true, but we have lost the context that could make that intelligible, that would justify that. And that's why today, when philosophers go about trying to justify moral egalitarianism, they're somewhat resourceless. They're not able to do it. They're in the same kind of position as the Hawaiians in when they were asked by the British, well, why is that taboo? Well, moral egalitarianism is true. I don't know. It's true. How could you possibly deny that? How could you possibly deny that we're all equal? You've got to be a monster to think something like that. No, it's just obviously true. Well, that's exactly the kind of response that the Hawaiians had given to Captain Cook and the British sailors when they were asked about their taboo rules. And what Nietzsche is pointing out, we are in the same exact situation or whatever. We are in the same exact state with regard to, say, something like moral egalitarianism. We can't justify it because we've abandoned the beliefs that would justify it. The concepts and rules of morality are simply these holdovers. They are the shadows on the wall of the cave that Nietzsche talks about in section 108 of the Gay Science. They are holdovers from the time before the death of God. The original context in which moral egalitarianism, but everything else also that we think of as morality, kindness, be kind, respect people, forgive people, be generous. right? And so on. Give everyone their due. And everybody, in some fundamental sense, is owed the same thing, or we're all fundamentally equal, and we just need to strive for that equality in some way. And everybody needs to be given their fair share, and so on. All of these ideas, all of these rules and concepts were originally embedded in the intellectual paradigm articulated by people like Plato and Aristotle, and then developed further by people like Avicenna, Avicenna and Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Muslim theologians all, or Maimonides, one of the greatest Jewish theologians in the Middle Ages, or people like Aquinas and Augustine, right? Christian theologians. This original context, which justified and made sense of things like moral egalitarianism or what we think of as the rules of morality, this original context was that intellectual paradigm, right? The Platonic, Aristotelian, Abrahamic paradigm. And so what Nietzsche is saying is that our moral rules have lost their intelligibility, are no longer justifiable, precisely because that intellectual context, that intellectual paradigm has been abandoned. Right? That's what MacIntyre claims Nietzsche is the first to see, that we today are in a very precarious position with regards to the justification of morality. And in particular, we can't do it. We don't have the requisite contexts. We don't have the requisite intellectual background, intellectual worldviews to do that.